Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to a special episode of Believe. We have a wonderful opportunity with Johann Kurtz to talk about his book, Leaving a Legacy. And he talks about this idea of inheritance, charity, and thousand-year families. And obviously, it's interesting to us. The whole concept of Believe is built on my father and his book and what he talked about and those principles for living. And we've republished the book after 50 years, but it's not quite 1,000 years. But there's principles that go into creating a community, creating a country, creating a dynasty, even if you take it outside of the family context. What do we do here in our town, in your hometown? What are we going to do to create the elements that allow success to continue from generation to generation and to move on and to create not only for this just the wealth to transfer and be held, but for it to be built upon, for communities, for neighborhoods to not just look back to the better times that were in their history, but to do things today that create a better future for themselves so they can keep marching forward. And I think those are the principles, as I read the book, Johann, that were most intriguing to me about how this connects back to my neighborhood, my community, my hometown, or your hometown, where you live, where you're from, your family, because you don't have to be wealthy to have these principles apply. And so whether they're the principles that my father wrote about in Believe and some of those ideas, they're kind of, there's a few things that overlap here, but I think that's the key, is to talk about those things that are really important, that have proven over the test of time. So when we're thinking about what do we choose to believe in, what are the ideas that we believe will lead to a better life for myself, for my family, for my neighborhood, for my community, that those ideas have some history. And there's a lot to them. So Johann, after that introduction, I want to first thank you for coming here. Thank you for spending a little time talking with us. And before I dive into the book, talk a little bit about how you were interested in the subject and how you determined you were going to write a book about it.
Absolutely. Well, listen, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I love Believe. The issue of legacy, of multi-generational families continuing the same projects as their ancestors, I think is a wonderfully romantic story, but I think it also has very practical impacts on the environment, both social and physical, that we navigate every day. The effects of the decisions of those families, their continued patronage of the same institutions, the same buildings, and so forth, they determine a lot in society. And growing up, I was conscious. I don't come from a great or noble dynasty or legacy, but I did go to a school with much history behind it, with beautiful buildings. It dates back to the 14th century, and I was really aware that, in some sense, I was the heir every day to that privilege, that I was living amongst, and I was going to church in these beautiful old buildings, and that was a real privilege. And in some sense, I was always plagued by the question, why did we stop? The churches that we were building, the buildings that we were building, they were certainly practical. I'm sure they were economically efficient and fit for purpose and so forth. But there was this real question of, why aren't we, in an age of tremendous affluence, in an age of upward mobility and so forth, why aren't we building these great and beautiful buildings anymore? Why is wealth so ephemeral today? There are these wealthy families that emerge into tremendous wealth and then disappear from history incredibly quickly now. And most of the ultra wealthy families in America don't trace their wealth back further than the 1970s. And in some sense, that's a wonderful thing, because it's an indicator, as I'm sure Rich would allude to, that we've created material conditions in society that allows people who really are talented, who are committed, who are disciplined, who have a great vision for what they want to achieve in life, to ascend upwards, to build really meaningful enterprises and homes and conditions for their family. And I think that's wonderful. But I think it does leave the second question unanswered, which is, why are the families who have achieved that, why do they struggle to sustain themselves? Why do they struggle to translate their new place in society into really beautiful architecture, into great new artistic works and so forth? Maybe it's controversial to suggest, but I do think that we live in an age that struggles to create really beautiful things. And my hope is that by examining the great families of the past who have committed themselves to these grand multi-generational projects, the creation of cathedrals, which took hundreds of years, patronized by the same family, and have generated for themselves the conditions of stability, of stewardship, of value transmission, of young people who are not corrupted by wealth, but manage to use it in the service of the good. Those are tremendously interesting questions to me, and it was not an easy subject to write about. I'm not sure I've done it justice, but it invokes philosophy and theology and history. So anyway, I think it's an interesting subject. So that's how I fell into it.
Philosophy, theology, and history. Very simple issues here, right?
Exactly.
But all coming together. Let me dive in a little bit just on the things that you opened with. You talk about you're going to school in this magnificent building that was built hundreds of years before. And as an American, we just don't have that much history. But do you think that geographically, when you're kind of in a new society or even a new country, even though we're celebrating our 250th anniversary, if you will, do you think we're aware of those things just by the presence of being around us? And do you think that by writing about it, you can help make people aware of their spot in history, their time, and this idea of not only achieving something for ourselves in our own time, but creating something for future generations, whether it's a family or whether it's a neighborhood or a community?
I think so. I think there's a lot there, and there's various factors that interrelate. The first thing I would say is that at one point, and still to this day in places, America had an amazing world-leading commitment to beautiful architecture. I mean, in many ways, America as a project is a revival of classical ideals of democracy, but also classical ideals of proportion and aesthetics and so forth. And the revival of those ideals into the great official buildings of American history was something Jefferson was interested in, and so forth. So there's a proud architectural history there, and I don't think American history is impoverished in this regard. But something has happened. Certainly something has happened. I think that there is an unfortunate overenthusiasm with the advent of the motor car that led to highways demolishing buildings that should never have been demolished. And unfortunately, when you lose that cultural muscle memory, when you lose that instinct, when you lose the kind of lived sense, of course I should be doing everything I can to make the building that my company is housed in, or my house, the most beautiful thing it can be, so that I can leave it for my generations that follow. It becomes something you don't even think about. And it's difficult to find architects that would think about that, and your friends haven't done it, and it's not an instinct. So I think these things are worth fighting for. I think beautiful buildings, enliven the spirits of everyone who walks past them, everyone who inhabits them. They're such a wonderful way to project civilizational values as well. It's an assertion of the importance of beauty and order, and a commitment to a place, and all these wonderful implications. And I do think that part of that is, if nothing else, it's very important to raise our children as best we can, to be educated in a way where they're aware of that history, where these things are important to them, where they're not intimidated, to be curious or engage, where it's completely legitimate to spend time thinking about these things. In the book, I talk about the Medicis a little bit, and yes. Lorenzo de' Medici, who is the sort of the grand patriarch of the Medici family and what it became, he was something of a technocratic figure. He was very successful in banking. But he was aware that to bring his family to the fullness of what it could have been, Cosimo de' Medici, his son, who's really famous for being one of the central figures at the heart of the Renaissance, would require a broader education. And in some sense, that was an act of humility. He knew what he wasn't capable of, but he hoped his son could be more than him, in order to bring his family and his city and the people they interacted with an element of beauty in their lives, and a degree of cultural and historical sophistication. So I think that's incumbent on us.
Yeah. It's interesting how I remember a lot of people talk about Detroit, Michigan, where it was, with the auto industry was one of the wealthiest ever, but the impact on the social structure was because everyone now could have a car. You moved out of the city, and the central location wasn't as important. And so, to a certain extent, that's a lot of what has happened, in our country. Without trying to dive into that too deeply, but just the ideas that we should remember about how to create place even in this new environment. We're not going to go back to the way it was, but we can create it. And I'm mindful here in our hometown of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and you're here visiting with us and you've seen some of that. And there's a lot of names on buildings, and we've talked about that a little bit, but they tend to be on places of arts and performance or hospitals or libraries, educational institutions. And so connect the dots for us of how neighbors, neighborhoods, families can be connected to institutions that will help shape our society. Certainly building a beautiful building where it's there, like, we have the art museum here, a lot was put into that. You talked about the symbolism of in Washington, D.C. of how, and sometimes when I'm there and you look at it and you see the grand nature of it all and how the founders thought about what they were creating so that even myself 250 years later can look at it and be reminded. How do you help us think through some of the ways that we should be thinking or we could be thinking about creating those sorts of institutions in our neighborhood, in our community?
Brilliant. Yeah. And one thing I'd say is that something families really struggle with now is families want to stay together. Parents want to see their children, they want to see their grandchildren. And that's much easier if people stay in close geographic proximity. Mm-hmm. Something that families really struggle with now, especially where they come from smaller towns, for example, is creating reasons why once their children go off to college or university, they should come back to their small town. Because the delights and temptations of the world are many. And,
sure.
In New York City or whatever it is a constant allure. And one of the things that you can do to create the conditions that make people nostalgic for their home and wish to return is to create a really beautiful environment. And that has all these subtle knock-on effects. When you sacrifice your wealth to create a beautiful public environment, a common wealth, as it were, I think other families in the community appreciate that. And that leads to a relationship between your family and their families who inhabit the same space. And it sort of institutes an economy of sacrifice and love that I think is great. And the other thing I would say is it sort of makes a demand of your descendants. When you put your name on a cultural institution, you're asserting that this institution, and if it's the opera, or classical music, or art, or education, you're asserting that this is important to our family. Mm-hmm. And our name is on the building. And it is very important that our children develop the capacity and maintain the family business such that we can continue to patronize that institution that is so dear to us that it bears our name into the future. In other words, it imposes obligations on future generations to think of themselves as the inheritor of duties. Alexis de Tocqueville, who I quote in the book, has this wonderful section on the importance of the family estate to his sense of identity. And he says, when you stand in your family estate, all generations are, as it were, contemporaneous, that you feel that you're in the lived presence of your ancestors, that because you walk among the things that they touched and they created and they valued and they shaped with their deep. I was in Windsor Palace recently, King Charles's seat, and there's a chapel there, and it's just amazing. It's a huge room made of stone. Every surface is carved with such intricate detail that merely by standing in the room, you can feel the depth of the faith of the people who built that institution, because the level of work and commitment that went into beautifying it in that way, you're struck by the intensity of their beliefs, of their faith. And you can't help but be moved by that. So I think that these things, they have a subtle importance that is too often neglected, but that we can absolutely bring back. I mean, we know how to build beautiful things. We just need to believe.
Yeah, just need to believe that. There we go. We need to believe in that and make it happen. One of the things that, I remember kind of in a personal sense, my parents, when they first gave a significant amount of money to the Performing Arts Center here, DeVos Hall, they were concerned about putting their name on and what that would be. They didn't want to be selfish. They didn't want to have it in that sense. But they had the discussion that by doing that, they could be an example and that they could encourage others So they, and a lot of the culture around here was, okay, you might give to the building and maybe there's a name on the building, but there's names on the rooms inside the building. There's names on the on different structures or on the bricks in the way building up. And so, and everybody could be part of building. It's not just the one name. It was everyone in the community could take ownership of it and have a stake in what they had done and what they had given and what they had contributed to building that institution. Do you see that element throughout history, or is that something relatively, that idea relatively new?
I think it's a completely legitimate practice. I think as long as you're honest, and I think your family absolutely were, that what is motivating that desire to place the name on the institution is exactly the kind of completely prudent motivation that you're describing, which is we want to be an exemplar in the community, not just as someone who gives to the arts, but as someone who encourages others to partake in the same economy. And I think we always have to be careful. Mm-hmm. The temptation is always there, of course, sure, when you make a grand donation to then step in front of the community and wait for your flowers and applause and so
right,
forth.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's always what it is, by any means. And no, you are struck. I think it's kind of wonderful. I mean, when you go around the city of Grand Rapids, you encounter the names of families, and there's something very personal about that. There's a sense that real people lived here and they cared about the place, that this wasn't just funded by whatever federal funding was apportioned by a committee somewhere for this city, and so it naturally got built as a result of technocratic or bureaucratic processes, that people lived here and they cared for the place. And that great figures love this place, and you should too. And you know, exactly as you say, it's an invitation to step into that story, to find your small place of the city that perhaps one day your family name can. And I imagine it's just lovely as the descendant of those first leading figures to walk amongst buildings that remind you of the commitment and the values and the generosity of your parents. The world takes on a phenomenological adornment when we find family everywhere we look. I think it's quite wonderful.
I love that. And I'll dive into your book a little bit here. And there's so many areas to explore. I hope we don't run out of time. I know we will run out of time, but I want to keep exploring so many areas. This idea of charity, you in the book, you talked about more, who is my neighbor? You brought a faith element into charity, and you brought a relational, and you talked about it right now, that there's real people in it. And you also use an example of how that can be lost. Talk about that a little bit. Talk about this idea of charity. What is real charity, and how sometimes just wealth it can almost ruin it.
It's a really complex and subtle issue.
Yeah.
I think in a financialized age, it is very tempting to say, well, as a wealthy person, my charitable duty is to give my wealth away. And there's something noble in that. There is something sacrificial. On the other hand, there is a temptation that devolves into what is sometimes called telescopic charity, which is, it's not that important that I meet working class people, or I live around people who are struggling, or that I understand their issues, or that I know them, or that I, dignify them with my attention and so forth, because I can write big checks, and that's not what charity is. Right. That maybe has its place, if you have financial resources and you can see a way that you can really change the world in some impactful. But charity, I think it's instructive to look at its theological history and the etymology of the term. Charity is derived from caritas, which is the Latin that was taken from the biblical Greek agape, which is a sort of refined form of love. It's love for your God, and recognizing your love for your God, that you have a duty to love your neighbor, his beloved creation, the dignity of man, and as he reflects your creator. And it has this intrinsically personal component to it. And charity, whenever charity doesn't involve a mutual knowing or sacrifice or love, I think strains the definition. Yeah. Charity is really it's a personal virtue. And I think that's empowering. I think that's terribly empowering, because what it means is that charity is not the preserve of the wealthy. It's all of our opportunity in every moment of our lives to live out this virtue, rather than, I write a big check once a year at Christmas and done and dusted, and now back to, whatever I'm, interested in. And I think that tension is important. It's always important to say, it's great that I'm doing powerful and effective things through institutions, But am I using that as an excuse to step away from the people who need me in subtle ways, who need me and my kindness or my knowledge or my acknowledgement or whatever it is? All of us we're human beings. We're not just people with bank accounts.
Right. And charity can be, one of the things you'll see even by my line of questioning or discussion here is to make sure everybody knows that they can participate in this. And sometimes it's easy. Well, it's just the wealthy, it's just the big foundations, it's just the big businesses. But one of the things that we've learned, I think we've tried to demonstrate in Grand Rapids, in our hometown, is that everybody can be involved. You can always give of your time, of your talent, even if you have modest treasure. You can do things, even a smile on the street as you're walking by somebody. We've joked a lot in Grand Rapids that sometimes people out of town, when they'll come by, a lot of people will greet them and just say hello, and people will say that's very unique about Grand Rapids because it's such a friendly, atmosphere, or Midwest nice, people would say. So I think that's a great element. But I want to move to a little bit a different thing, because to be charitable, my father used to say a lot, if you want to be a good philanthropist, you better have a good business. And so this idea of creating wealth, preserving wealth, building on wealth, again, not just with one person or with one family, but can be broadened to a community. But there are elements that are important to it. Let me toss a couple, and you referenced it earlier in the chapel with the beauty that you saw there. Talk about faith as a foundation, and even in charity, it's an act of responsibility and an understanding that we serve a God who has given these gifts to us, and therefore we are vessels to share. They're not ours necessarily. We have a short lifespan. We have other responsibilities, but we have a stewardship responsibility. Talk about that a little bit, of how a family, any family, not even with wealth necessarily, but can live and create a sense of virtue and values inside their family that can build a legacy.
The theologian Andrew Willard-Jones is, I think, wonderful on this. He's a figure that I've taken a lot from. And he points out that when you conceive of charity in this way, it impacts your definition, your understanding of what a good business is. Is a good business merely one that generates profit, or is it one which dignifies people with labor and pays them a wage that they can raise a family on, and situates that business not in wherever is most convenient in the world for profit maximization, but acts as a tool in a community, in a rooted community? And so the richness of that understanding really unlocks, I think, a lot of possibilities for charity, for love, that are otherwise difficult. One of the other things that Willard-Jones points out is that our understanding of property has really atrophied in the last, certainly from the sort of height of Christendom, as it were. And that the biblical word is dominion. And dominion ties together a sense of ownership, yes, but also a sense of stewardship, a sense of, he says, dominion carries with it the burden of rule. That actually everything we have for a purpose. There's a telos to it. It makes demands of us, and that wealth can't be justified if that wealth is not doing good things. On the other hand, wealth in the hands of a virtuous person is a wonderful thing, because it says that, not money for money's sake, but the ability to impact the world, to order the world, to bring the world into the dignity of rational order, as it were. We're all workers called to do that, wherever our situation. So I find that concept of dominion, which is from the Latin root domus, which is house, so it has this living relational component. It always comes back to that cornerstone of civilization, the family, both your family and all the other families that your family is in communion or covenant with. So I love to see the world in this sacramentalized way, where everything, the home, the enterprise, is imbued with this intrinsic meaning, with this metaphysical significance, because it brings out a richness in the world that I think it beautifies it.
Yeah. So connecting it back, it helps. In your book, there is this underlying, theme of faith, of putting yourself in a place, and that the family can also do that when you're part of different generations, where you go back to what your grandparents, great grandparents did, how they, in many cases, how they maybe came to this country, or where they came from, or what they did, and those sorts of traditions, those sorts of that sort of heritage, and in many cases, it's a faith-based element, but it also connects on the family side, and there are a lot of things that tear families apart today, that stop those traditions or that heritage from passing along. And as we talk about leaving a legacy, what are the things that we should be thinking about if you're just with grandchildren, if you're just with young children, if you're just getting married and starting out? There's this different stages of life that you need to think about, because so many times when you're young, you're just trying to figure it out. You're trying to get ahead. You're trying to make something happen, and you're maybe starting your family, and you're thinking about the economic ramifications of how many children you're going to have, how are you going to care for them, and how are you going to create the right space, and how both spouses are going to be working, and what that's going to be. What are some of the elements that we should be thinking about in different stages of our lives to create this institution of a family that really is the cornerstone of the institution of the neighborhood, which is the institution of the community, and so on. So maybe help us understand in your research what you've seen from some of the great families of the time and attention that they've given and what they've done.
One thing I would say is, before you've begun a family, I think it seems very intimidating to people, especially those people who are at the beginning of their careers, to start a family. Right. And there's a lot of messages out in the broader culture that, that's unsustainable, it's uneconomical, maybe you can afford 1 or 2 children when you're very wealthy, but it'll cost $800,000 to have a family. Right. And I think at a certain level, certainly if you're a Christian, you have to put those messages aside and trust in God. Mm. And I would say that in my own life, that practice has yielded wonderful fruit, in that, atypically amongst our social circle, my wife and I got married and started a family in our 20s. And I think everyone was vaguely horrified that we were making such an imprudent decision. And some people more...
So young.
Yeah, what are you doing? Live your life, experience, and so forth. But as unwise as I'm sure it seemed, you muddle through, And so I think that's the cornerstone of everything, is trusting in God and knowing that the future is an uncertain place, and tragedy may strike or great blessings may accrue. But always, especially in the concept of the deep future, as it were, dynasty, legacy, that is ultimately in the hands of God. It's an act of hubris to believe that your will can, grab the future and forge the future that you want. But I think, in terms of what the really great families, the really long-standing dynasties do, that is of relevance to all families, I think there's a lot there. Edward Habsburg has written a really wonderful book called The Habsburg Way, which is a family history, in a sense, and the practices, the rituals that they engaged in that allowed their family to be one of the leading dynasties of European history for almost 1,000 years. And it's funny, he starts with the most simple things. He says, it all starts at the dinner table. You get your family together every night for dinner, and it's in that environment that the children learn that they matter, and that they are part of a family, and that their identity is integrated into the family identity. And they have to learn the art of listening and talking and presenting their opinion. And it's funny, these time-tested practices now in our modern scientific age, they're often validated by the literature. And it turns out that family dinner every night is a wonderful underpinning of academic performance and psychological stability and so forth. So never do the thing that some people mistakenly pursue, which is sacrificing too much time with your children. Of course, working long hours, it comes with the territory of starting a business, just to make more money so that you can pass that on to your children as your legacy. Because if you don't introduce that stability, the centrality of family, you're pouring fuel on something where the embers are just beginning to glow. It's a bit dangerous. The other thing I would say is that for me, ritual and the question of ritual is of central importance, because a ritual is something that you repeat across time, and often families have their sort of psychological anchor, their spiritual anchor in these rituals that persist. An example is the British royal family, who have a Maundy Thursday tradition going back 1600 years in the UK, where they give out coins on a certain day, and it's highly ritualized. And Queen Elizabeth in particular loved this. And what that does is it allows you to step into a role that your ancestors once inhabited, and you can kind of live as they lived for a short time. You can be who they were for a short time because you're sharing in the identity of the moment. And rituals, they're these warm and nostalgic homes in time, as it were. To quote Byung-Chul Han, who's a wonderful philosopher, the house is a home in space, the ritual is the home in time. It's something we return to. It allows this sense of identity integration, a sense of family continuity. It sort of asserts that things recur. And this may sound kind of magical or a bit too much for some people, but I think in a subtle way, this is totally natural. I mean, Christmas, for example, it's a ritual. And part of our attachment to the institution of Christmas is its ritualized aspect. We return to the same things. If there's a Christmas tree, there's carols, there's Christmas lights, and all of these things are this wonderful return to a world imbued with a higher meaning. All of these things have significance. And so they assert a continuity, they assert the persistence of the sacred, and they allow us to step out of ourselves into this kind of greater and continuous identity. So, partake in the old rituals of your civilization. And if you're not sure what your rituals are, just sort of ask, what are the things we do as a family that we love? And how could we elevate that into something that is symbolically endowed, that we really treat carefully, that we really, even if it's a bit theatrical and performative, that's fine. That's charming for children, especially.
Interesting. So when you talk about that, a couple things come to mind. One, when you talk about dinner, when you talk about a family gathering, whatever it is, everybody can do that. You don't have to be from a wealthy family to do that. Then there's some of the things that maybe tear at that, where a lot of times around whether it's Thanksgiving or in the United States or Christmas time, where the family gatherings, politics are going to be raised. People can't talk, or this uncle is doing this, or this is happening there, and everybody gets scared of it. But families, I always say relationships and families are a contact sport, right? You've got to be connected, and you've got to be able to deal with that. How do what are some of your thoughts about how to maybe overcome some of those things or not be afraid of them? And the other thing you talked about was, if there's not a tradition, ask about it, or maybe is it possible to start one's own? To say, here's what we're going to start. Here's a tradition that we're going to start in our family now, and here's what we're going to do going forward. So parents, in some way, can we give them the power, the strength to create that environment for their kids and tell them, yes, you're going to be at dinner. Yes, you're going to come to this thing. This is what we do. Talk about that a little bit and maybe encourage or empower parents who maybe when society today are saying, hey, it's too much trouble to cook. It's too much trouble, to cook every night. It's too much trouble to invite your, the broader family over for a holiday tradition. It's too much trouble for this and that. But maybe say, no, there's so much benefit. Maybe talk about that a little bit.
Well, it's funny. I think this relates to our charity discussion earlier. And what is charity? How do you be charitable? And in a sense, if charity is abstracted out of personal relationships and into these grand institutional structures like, mega bureaucratic charity institutions that you send money to. Another home for that kind of, in my opinion, erroneous thinking is politics. Well, I'm a good person because my politics are right. And you're a bad person if your politics are wrong.
Right.
And so therefore my duty to turn you into a good person and be a good person myself is to argue with you with everything I have to try and move you into a better place. But if you understand charity in its fullness as respecting the God-given likeness and dignity of every human being, then it sort of creates space to, perhaps there's an element of what we call fraternal correction. If you think there's something really bad going on, then you have the confidence to try and help your brother or your sister get out of that situation. But it implicates lovingly imbuing every conversation with a certain element of charity, really trying to understand another person, not looking to run them over with an argument or whatever it is.
Or to win the argument.
Win the argument, but also to respect everyone else's desire for a warm and nostalgic time with their family. That's another duty you have. That is important. These deep bonds of love should never be sacrificed for an abstract, political argument. So I think it helps you return to that. And these things are so important. There's a study I read. I'm Catholic, and it was about differentiating the families that transmitted their Catholic faith successfully between generations, and those that failed to do so, which is a tragically large percentage of religious families of all Christian denominations. They really struggle to pass on a profoundly living faith to their children. And one of the things you find is that the families who have little success in this regard, they sort of regard church as the place where we do religion. And when we step outside of church, that's not the religious place. We just do our normal secular things. We go about our daily lives. The families who are successful tie every warm moment, every moment of connection, every moment of ritual, the prayers before bed, and the quiet at certain times, and whatever your little rituals are, they connect that to a higher metaphysical question, and that really, I think that imbues the world again with this beauty and significance, that what would otherwise be prosaic routines take on this thing of sacrality. It is the key in many ways to a nourishing life, spiritually, physically, to live in that world of meaning and significance.
The idea that you can leave something somewhere and then be a different person somewhere else, it just seems, it seems an easy trap to fall into. I'll be good over here, but I want to go do this on the weekend, or I'll do this to the public, but here's what I want to do in private, and here's what I'll share with my family, but here's what I'm going to share with the community, and to try to live that. I'd always think that would just be so confusing to try to keep all those things straight in your head. I'm not smart enough to be able to do those sorts of things. And so the idea of wearing your heart on your sleeve, am I kind of hearing that correctly? That if you're a person of faith, you've got to express it or live it. If you're a person who has this sense of belief, you express it and you live it. But if you're also demonstrating your faith, you're respecting other people for what they do or don't do, without trying to judge them. Is that also a piece of the puzzle?
I think that's right. I mean, one thing that's really changed in the last few hundred years is a transition away from the home as a locus of all kinds of activity. So if you go back to the Middle Ages, what you find is that the home is the economic center of most people's existence. Mm-hmm. Whether you're an agricultural worker, you're working right next to your home, and both husband and wife are largely collaborating in this productive enterprise, and your church is close by, and your finances are tied up in the assets of your home, and everything is sort of integrated. You live, in some sense, in a home, broadly construed. And what changes with the advent of the Industrial Revolution and various other societal factors, the abstraction of finance in the 20th century and so forth, is that these elements start undergoing a certain separation. You live here and you work over here, and there's a 2-hour commute between the two. And your wife works for this company, and you work for this company, and you don't know her boss, and then you go to church once a week, and then you come home, and there's your house isn't seen as a sacred place in some way, and that is what it is. I don't think those factors are likely to reverse anytime soon, but I think it sort of calls on us to rediscover our entire lived existence as a home, as it were. We need to find those moments of connection between the different spaces that we inhabit, and sort of. This is obviously easier said than done, and in such a dynamic world in such a mobile world where people move, families move, you change careers, this is of course a real challenge. And I don't mean to downplay that or to come up with some saccharine solution. Treat everything as the home.
Right.
But I think that situation lends itself to a cynicism that I think must be rejected. And again, we need to rediscover charity in its fullest sense as we go about the world.
Yeah, interesting that home was the economic engine. So maybe I can start to shift a little bit to when we're talking about 1,000-year families and leaving a legacy. It really it starts around home. But there's usually a business or an economic piece of the puzzle, but it can't be disconnected. And so I heard recently from a business consultant, a very senior gentleman, who was saying businesses who lose their way. This is how the company started, and then for whatever reason they lost their way, then they fail. He said, you have to put the church back in the center of the village. what are those values? What are those real beliefs? You have to put them back in the center of the village. And as you're talking about, this idea of faith and family, but there's economics associated with that too, of how you're going to provide for your family, how you're going to take care, how you're going to have productive work and the honor of work and the duty of work, and building that legacy. And so there's an idea that when you talk about legacies and 1,000-year families, that you're talking about a group of people who've been successful, and that's it. They're only there. They're always going to be successful. Nobody else can get there. But then you have this this idea of mobility that shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. That there's people who can gain wealth and lose wealth, and that there's some mobility in there. Maybe talk a little bit about that, and that if you're not where you want to be, you can do something to get there. And when you're there, what are you going to do to preserve and continue to build upon that, whatever level you may be as a family or as an individual?
Brilliant. So first of all, I love to put the church back in the center of the village.
That's a great.
It's wonderful.
When he mentioned that, I said, I'm going to steal that one. That's really good.
Because it's such a perfect metaphor. I mean, the church is in the center of the village, and it is constructed in the historic fashion with the spire, which draws your eyes upwards. So everyone is aware that everyone else they're in the community with, in the village with, they have a central reference point, and that central reference point orients your eyes upwards. In other words, there's a profound sense of mutual belonging, even as people and families are dispersed around the city. It's kind of all for the same thing. It's like the anchor at the heart of society. And the same is true exactly of the business and of the family and everything else. Yeah, I think that's wonderful. In terms of, here's what I'd say. The 20th century introduced some changes which were wonderful for social mobility. And I think one of the most inspiring messages at the heart of Believe is a call to arms to take advantage of the society we've created to really make things. And it is amazing, the access that we now have to, free and open markets and the incredible wealth of knowledge that the internet provides and so forth, to really build things that people would have struggled to build in previous generations, to take on that agency and that belief, that sense of action in the world, to participate in our likeness of the creator through creation, through there's something very
innovation, entrepreneurship.
There's something wonderful about that. On the other hand, those same factors that created the potential for that mobility created the potential for rapid, at least, dissolution of wealth. If you go back to 1800 and before in America, 90% of Americans work in agriculture and the majority work on family farms. And when there's the question of inheritance, what the children are receiving are a family farm, which is wonderful. It's important and a source of income, and yes, a source of privilege, if you wanted to use that language. But it's also a profound locus of responsibility. Yeah. My father built this thing, you need to maintain it. Yeah. And maintaining it is going to require a lot of hard work, and it's going to be dawn till dusk stuff, and you better be tough and disciplined and committed and understand this as an act of stewardship. It's not just... Whereas now it's quite common to give an inheritance in the form of just liquid cash or stocks and shares or a house that you expect your child will sell because, of course, they're going to move somewhere else in the country. And that, I think, is a little bit dangerous because what you're really giving is wealth without that communication of stewardship and duty and so forth. One thing that I think is very important about family businesses is in the American context where you don't perhaps have this commitment to great landed estates, you nonetheless have this somewhat illiquid institution that you're passing on with the expectation they don't sell it, and they have their identity bound up in it, and you want them to steward it, and you want them to continue building it. And so that's what I would suggest for people who have made tremendous wealth, and good on you, and hopefully are supporting other families in their community through jobs and building new opportunities for other people. I would encourage you to ask, how can you solidify those assets into things which will last? How are you initiating your children into recognizing their value, into not just regarding them as a fact of life, but again through this symbolic endowment and this adornment of the world with a reference to higher things, projecting them as something that you want to live on and an integral aspect of the family identity. Family businesses, I think, are very important in this regard, but also, land, if if you've invested very deeply in building a beautiful house and a beautiful community that is thriving and having children and, defying the birth rate and family formation crisis that we now have, I think you can ask of your children, you can say, this is my life's work and I will give you great and wonderful things, but I would really love it if you stay close and we as a family continue to exist together. So I think that question of liquidity versus illiquidity is one of the great challenges of our time. And my hope is that the book gives families at least some tools to think about that particular challenge more carefully.
Yeah. So dive in a little bit deeper on that. I'm really curious because you raised as well this idea of, of generating wealth or creating wealth or then having wealth, but just passing it on. A lot of us would think, well, it's just an exercise of estate planning and you're just passing wealth on, but it's so much more. But there's also a phenomenon where a lot of people who created wealth would say, well, I'm not going to give it to my children. I'm going to give it away. I'm going to do something different. And without trying to judge one way or the other, but just to talk about the idea of wealth transfer, of maybe your legacy and your wealth is in your family, is in that next generation, but there's work to do to pass on the virtues and the values. So maybe can you share a little bit? We've talked about that a lot, but in that context of if someone's like, well, I don't know about my kids, I'm worried about them. Well, what can they do to give that value of work, to create that agency, to what can they do when they're young or when they're maybe even a little bit older? Because I remember my father always said, you may grow up and be an adult, but I'm always going to be your dad. I'm always going to be your parent. I think that I may be different in my interaction with my children today than when they were young, but I'm still their dad and I'm still the parent. And so Maria and I still have a responsibility. So what should families be thinking about when there's the range of choices? Well, I can leave my legacy to this endowment over here. I can leave it to this charity over here. I can leave it in this, this property over here, or I can leave it in my children or my family and maybe connect all those dots because we want them to be charitable. We want them to be, industrious. We want them to be this, but we also want this faith formation, this family formation, these other elements. What are some of the things that a family could, if they're, is listening today, that they could be thinking about if they're not where they want to be, or if they're looking at some of these issues, or they're at that space of either creating wealth or creating something in their family of meaning and purpose, and to say, I want to decide to pass this to my family. I want my legacy to be, if I'm going to leave this legacy, I want to leave it with my family because that's the only thing that's truly going to last the test of time. Buildings fall down, land gets bought and sold, businesses can fail.
There's a real tension. The first thing I would observe is, we should start by consecrating our wealth to God. In other words, we should recognize that we have what we have, and we use what we use, and we have the gifts that we have only for the service of God.
Yeah. Because we're created. We're created by God.
Absolutely. And if in some sense we intuit that our children simply are not prepared to inherit tremendous, especially liquid wealth, we're not doing them a service, and it's not a moral action to just to turn them into lottery winners. And lottery winners actually have very poor psychological outcomes and practical outcomes because they're simply not prepared for the sudden jerk in responsibility and purpose and meaning and station and network and identity that great wealth brings. And so I completely sympathize with those families that say in exasperation, like, look, I'm not sure my child is ready for this. My hope is that there are tools which are available to make sure your child is ready for that.
Prepared.
And not, by the way, it doesn't have to be something that you have to start from the time they're 1 year old and a regular. It's great if it is, but it all comes back to this question of domus, dominion, the house, this living relational covenant between people. And so that's what I'd say there. But I think it is very important to think in terms of multi-generational projects of the family. The great cathedrals of Europe, these magnificent institutions, they were created under the sustained patronage of specific families who understood themselves as the patrons of those institutions over hundreds of years. And I think that our society today is suffering from that lack of great multi-generational works. So it is important, if you can, to, and by the way, what you describe, putting the church at the center of the village in your family business, That is much easier to achieve if your business is not a publicly traded company, if it genuinely is a family asset, because you have the right to assert your particular values over this institution, which is your family's property, and you can really imbue your character and your the way that you understand the world into that particular institution in a way that is much more difficult if you have to maximize shareholder value, as it were. Right. So there is this centrality of the family. In other words, we need to be preparing children very carefully, and faith is at the heart of this. If you can use faith to impose upon children, there are rewards which their money will never buy for them, and there are punishments which their money will never spare them from. And they're just like everyone else in that sense. They are situated in a divine narrative, and their money is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. Then hopefully you can reintroduce that incentive structure to help them strive towards great things, even from a position of affluence. And that's what I really try and focus on, is how do you create that greatness of mind and and instill those virtues into children such that they can use great things for great purposes.
I love that piece, that there's things that money can't buy, and there's punishments that you can't buy your way out of, because in that case we're all children of God. We're all created in that level and standard, and we're all accountable at the end of the day to Him for the life that we've lived. Many years ago, I had an experience where my father's partner, Jay Benando, passed away. And right around that time, a wonderful woman, a housekeeper in our home that I grew up with, passed away as well. And so we had, a very, visible funeral for Jay in the community and that sort of thing. And then a very quiet funeral for her. But I went to her funeral and was thinking about the welcome they both got in heaven. They were both filled with faith. And that Jay couldn't bring his wealth to heaven. He brought himself in his life, just like she did. And the celebration was the same, because, a child had come home. That was my perspective and my belief in that. And so we're all equal before God in that sense. Yet we still have responsibilities with whatever talents God's given us to maximize them and be good stewards along the way. And so I love hearing these things and how you talk about thinking in this way. And maybe in the time that we have as we kind of wrap up this wonderful conversation. And thank you again for your time. Thank you for writing this book. Thank you for your time here in Grand Rapids with us to talk about these ideas. And so maybe just a few closing thoughts from you. What's the takeaway? So somebody reads your book and they learn these sorts of things. They see the research that you've done and the piece that you've brought, and maybe you can weave in, because I know we're running out of time here, this idea of we're talking about virtues and values, and one of the ideas that you put in there might be a little controversial. So maybe we'll reserve time. I'll pull my other question back and go with this one. This concept of meritocracy, and that we love in America, right? We pull yourself up by your bootstraps, make things happen, away you go. You can do all these sorts of things. But you say sometimes we've narrowed the scope too much of what we mean by it, and we lose the fullness of the person. Maybe you can talk about that for a second, and then I'll ask you kind of to close, because this was something I forgot about. I wanted to hit.
Well, I think we have a certain cultural chauvinism with our conception of meritocracy. In other words, we believe that at this moment in time, we stumbled upon this brilliant belief that the most capable people should lead.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's any civilization in Western history that wouldn't have asserted the same thing. They just had different understandings of what excellence is. The Greeks spoke of arete, the certain quality of excellence amongst leaders. And I don't think there are many civilizations across Christendom that haven't believed that great and virtuous men shouldn't have the possibility to make them something of themselves in life. I think, unfortunately, what has happened is that there are situations in which our contemporary conception of meritocracy is an exceptionally useful and powerful tool. We do want, pilots to be able to fly their plane and to pass the right certifications and so forth. But on the other hand, I think that some people take it too far, and they allied in their minds uncritically. Merit means getting great exam scores and doing great informalized tests and other things and nothing else. But merit also means loyalty. It means a sense of identity and a sense of the responsibility of an inheritance. It means love. It means, And this is sort of proven by the fact that family businesses outperform in the marketplace. The literature is quite clear on this. Professor John A. Davis, formerly of Harvard Business School, wrote wonderfully on this, that while family businesses do better than so-called meritocratic businesses that claim to see nothing but performance,
right,
because they think on very long time horizons, and people have an intrinsic loyalty to institutions and so forth. So there's a place for meritocracy, but what I write in the book is, don't make terrible sacrifices for this abstract ideal that I think is quite incomplete in certain ways.
Yeah, that's a really important element there. Of course, we want good performers. We want our pilots and our doctors and all those people to be experts in their field. But there's also a bedside manner. There's also a judgment call. There's also things that fall into all those sorts of elements that create the best in those fields. Mm-hmm. Because they have those other elements with them as well. So thank you for going there. Now we'll kind of try to bring this to a close as you talk about legacy, all the things in the book. For all the viewers, folks who are our audience here, what are some of the things you'd like to leave with them? Here's a few things to think about. So to challenge themselves in the element of this podcast of what could they believe? What are the things they should think about that may shape their beliefs to define a legacy and leave a legacy?
I think I would say, don't wait until the end of your life to ask what you're leaving behind. You see some people write in their wills very complex prescriptions for exactly how their descendants have to behave if they're going to get their inheritance. But all families, no matter what their station, in really everything they do, they leave their mark on the world. In the homes they leave behind, and in their rituals, and in their children's memories, and in the relationships they have with the people in their community, their place in the world. It's important. And I would encourage people to try and situate themselves in history and in community, and sort of, in a sense of love, see those ripples of one's choices sort of going out throughout the community and throughout time. And I think that's kind of wonderful. It's an assertion that all of us matter.
I think that's a lovely way to bring this to an end. Don't wait till the end. Don't wait. Take action now. Define your legacy. Leave your legacy. Be active in your family, your home, your neighborhood, your community, whatever the case may be. So, Johann Kurtz, thank you so much for taking your time to be with us here on the Believe podcast and to share your wisdom. And so for all of our audience, thank you for joining us. I hope you found this conversation helpful and enlightening for the things that you're going to create in your life, in your neighborhood, in your community, in the same way that you can leave a legacy with your family and for generations beyond. Johann, once again, thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And we'll look forward to seeing you all at the next episode of Believe.